Olney, like any other neighborhood in Philadelphia, is home base for some very unique and special people, but it might not be the place where they spend most of their waking hours. In this episode, we are going to meet two such individuals, Ellen Somekawa and Reverend Roger Zepernick, both of whom have touched many lives in different parts of the city through their activism. In Ellen's case, that place is Chinatown.
My name is Clayton Prince. You may have noticed I'm not Asian, but my children are. And I believe that we all have to support each other, no matter what our ethnicity is. Some of you guys may know me, some of you may not. A long time ago, I was on a TV show called The Cosby Show. I was Lisa's boyfriend. And I played Stevie in a movie called Hairspray. I'm a Philadelphia resident. My question is really simple. Why can't you guys stay where you are? The reason that I heard was that the lease is about to be up and you have to go somewhere. So why can't you build something right next to where you are now?
You can't, the 76ers remain staying at the Wells Fargo Center or in South Philadelphia. Something that is a trend generally is more arenas in downtown areas, which is something... And we think that, and I know a lot of people in this room do not agree with this.
That was a brief exchange from a community meeting in Chinatown last December, when a representative from the 76ers Development Corp was grilled by a community member on the merits of a proposed new basketball arena, which is seen as a threat to the existence of Philadelphia's Chinatown. How this latest large development incursion into this cherished ethnic enclave will end remains to be seen. But to Ellen Somekawa, the 76ers arena proposal must seem like Groundhog's Day.
Ellen and her family have lived in Olney for 3 decades. Although her life's work has been outside of the neighborhood, we are proud to call Ellen a neighbor. When we interviewed Ellen last summer, it was just 1 week after the Philadelphia 76ers development arm announced their intention to build a new basketball arena on Market Street, replacing half of the current Fashion District complex. The arena would extend from the Fashion District, consuming parts of what is now Filbert Street, and literally loom 1 block away from the Friendship Gate of Chinatown. The intentions of the developers are to have the new arena ready by 2031. For Ellen, this news was déjà vu all over again. She fought alongside her other Chinatown colleagues and allies against other large development projects that have threatened Chinatown's existence, including a baseball stadium and a casino. Both projects failed due to their tireless efforts to protect this immigrant hub from the so-called economic drivers of predatory capitalists.
Our second featured guest in this episode is Reverend Roger Zepernick, who settled in Olney upon his retirement in 2015. Retirement, though, is somewhat of a misnomer for Reverend Roger. His 6-decade history of living and working in Philly has been intertwined with the Latino community. He continues to be a staunch ally and activist on their behalf, including a recent stint on the board of Olney Charter High School. In this episode, we feature Ellen Somekawa and Reverend Roger Zepernick, 2 lions of social justice who have fought and continue to fight the good fight for the rights of immigrant communities and the working poor in the city of Philadelphia.
Once the traditional homeland of the Lenape indigenous peoples, the Olney section of Philadelphia has changed dramatically since Europeans colonized the region in the late 1700s. Its history reflects the rise and decline of industrialization during the last century, in tandem with waves of immigration and migration by families from various parts of the world. Each successive generation of arrivals have contributed their own cultural traditions to the community, while having to negotiate the complexities of coexisting with neighbors from different geographic origins. Olney crackles with the energy of this dichotomy. Today, Olney is a linguistic multicultural melting pot. Its evolution reveals the multi-layered narratives of its residents who bring their diverse lived experiences and resilience to this mostly blue-collar neighborhood. In the second season of our podcast, we will highlight some of those stories, from garden growers to at-home chefs, community activists to youth mentors, small business owners to entrepreneurial artists, and more. You'll hear their voices and witness their journeys as they continue to make Olney the dynamic place that it is. A production of Olney Culture Lab of Culture Trust Greater Philadelphia, in collaboration with Amber Art and Design, this is Audio Olney, a podcast exploring the beauty, complexity, and diversity of the Olney section of Philadelphia. Sit back and enjoy. Funding for Audio Olney is provided by Independence Public Media Foundation, with additional support from William Penn Foundation and PICO.
It is Sunday, March 26th, and we have all in Philadelphia received a notification that we shouldn't be drinking our water because there was a big chemical spill in the Delaware. And our topic for tonight's conversation is about community activism. And I'm just thinking about, this is just recent stuff that's happening right now. But what's really top of my mind is environmental activism and the importance of it. Because now here we are in a situation where there's no water at the supermarkets. We all just got this notification at noon today. And then we got another notification saying that as of tomorrow, it's safe to use water, but as of tomorrow, it won't be for drinking or for showering or even washing dishes. So it's just making me think of how important activism, community activism is around environmental issues. Can you speak on the role of community activism?
Everything is interconnected and related, and you pollute things upriver, it comes downriver. It also makes me think of recently the train crash in East Palestine, where corporations wanted to give each of the residents $1,000 to basically satisfy them, and that was their response, a very meaningless monetary compensation, a bribe, if you will. Naturally, the residents were irate in their response. And here we have a 8,000-gallon latex spill in our water systems that have subsequently disallowed people to drink their own water, which we pay good bills for. And again, just like in East Palestine, what is the sense of accountability? What is the sense of elected officials in their response and representation in terms of the well-being and health of their constituents? What is going to be the response of the community at large to make sure that there is that sense of protection, that sense of communal health? Community activism has always been a response to these situations. When you have one of the strongest and most historical rooted Chinese communities in the urban environment in the entirety of the United States, what is going to be the sense of protection for those spaces when corporate-minded people can come and just take over an area and subsequently look to displace people. No matter what the lip service that they give and all the caveats that they might hand out, it comes back to the power of the people and the realization that one finger can never act alone in the same strength that a fist can. And every once in a while, we en masse have to use the power of our numbers to push back against the government, against the governing, and against the elite, the people who only have their self-interest in a capitalist system that look at communities sometimes as just being expendable. It takes leadership, and it takes communication, and it takes a unified voice and a rallying cry to have people kind of come to the consciousness that will get them off their seats and get them out of the comfort of their homes to realize that there is a mandate, a necessity to kind of push back.
The hot-button issue of the 76ers in Chinatown and activism in general make a compelling lens in which to introduce our featured guests. Reverend Roger Zepernick and Ellen Somekawa are two individuals whose collective wisdom speaks boldly to the struggles against oppression, because their campaigns against social injustices and systemic racism in Philadelphia over the last half-century cover a wide chunk of recent history. We are breaking this episode into two parts to allow their words to breathe and hold space.
Coincidentally, both Ellen and Reverend Roger hail from the Midwest. She's originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's from Western Ohio. And those places were where the seeds of their political awakening were sown.
So I grew up in a pretty wealthy suburb of Minneapolis. My brother and I were the only two students of color through school until we were in high school. And racism was not very in my face. But at the same time, I knew that I was different and I didn't have words for it. I did grow up always being told, you have to speak up in class discussion and participate more and this and that. And I realized that lived a lot of those childhood years just really trying to be invisible, like just not seen. And then I really didn't know anything about the fact that my parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles had all been incarcerated in America's internment camps in World War II until I was 15. And it was because my parents dragged us to this sukiyaki fundraiser for the Japanese American community, and somebody handed me a leaflet, said, "Don't let this ever happen again." I'm like, what happened? And so the fact that I didn't learn about it through school or my parents, but through some person handing me this leaflet was it just turned my world upside down. I went into my civics teacher. I was like, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by not teaching us this, right? Because I really did grow up just like America is the greatest country in the world, perfect, freedom, everything. And then to learn about this, and it just shook my foundations when I was suddenly thinking, oh, you've been lying to me this whole time, thinking this about my schools. And so I started to get very assertive, very questioning, very active. I was in these teen years during the height of the anti-Vietnam War movement. I'm learning about the internment camps, and I'm looking at pictures of atrocities in Vietnam and the dehumanization of other Asian people. Then my parents sent my brother and I on this Rotary tour to Japan, and we visited Hiroshima, and then I'm visiting that museum. I'm seeing like the total inhumanity of that. A lot was happening to me when I'm 15 years old, and I'm becoming a different kind of person at that point.
Ellen's political evolution continued to grow, and she found common cause with other Asian groups.
And at that point, started getting active in anti-Vietnam War movement, found other Asian American young people who wanted to be active. And this was at the beginnings of the first Asian American movement, right? This was at a time when the whole concept of Asian American was first becoming even a word or a concept. And the idea behind it was not a census category. It was Asian American as a term that is recognizing that the experience of different Asian nationalities in the United States is similar because of racism, right? It's like, so the reason that Asian American became a term and a concept was this recognition that we have something in common, right? Although I'm a third generation Japanese American and you're a first generation Filipino, you're a refugee from Vietnam. Like those concepts of how similar we've been treated through different times in history and the kind of power and strength of uniting together and learning about that history together and standing up together. I started getting involved with that. Yeah, and so that was kind of my political awakening.
Ellen bounced in and out of college in Minnesota while exploring her political identity as an activist within the anti-apartheid movement and anti-nuclear movement. She then decided to move to Philadelphia to embark on a graduate degree at UPenn in urban history, actually as a way to take a break from activism.
I ended up at Penn in the early 80s, and it was the most alienating experience of my life. I regress to being a child again, or totally silent, invisible. I should have walked into my first graduate seminar, and then I should have packed my bags and gone back to Minnesota. Like it was that alienating, that wrong. When I came to Penn, part of the idea of getting away from Minnesota was that I was going to have a fresh start, and I was going to focus on being a success at being a PhD student, and I was not going to be a dropping out, doing activism all the time. I was going to have a fresh start, be a good student. So that lasted for about 3 years. And then I was like, there's a point at which you realize like you just can't survive by pretending that like injustice doesn't exist. Being at Penn, at a certain point, then I met Asian Americans United. And then I just got active with them. And I just started learning so much about the community here. Immediately was able to dive into their youth work and just fell in love with these young people that Asian Americans United was working with. And interestingly, the core of Asian Americans United were people kind of my generation who had been through this experience of the earlier Asian American movement. But everybody had gone and done their adult life and become a lawyer or a teacher, whatever they became. But then when Southeast Asian refugees started to arrive to Philly in large numbers, those people came together and said, oh man, we have a crisis because anti-Asian violence, how kids are being treated in school, the housing people are being put in. So people with that kind of history that was similar to mine had formed Asian Americans United, and getting involved with that group really became a political home for me.
Reverend Roger's story begins a little earlier in Ohio. He shares how his spiritual calling eventually drew him to the city of brotherly love in the mid-60s.
I'm actually from Ohio, so I'm from farmlands, but further west, northwestern Ohio, flatland. But I was able, after high school, to go to college, Ohio University. And after Ohio University, I wanted to go to seminary. I was actually a Lutheran pastor, ordained a Lutheran pastor. And the Lutheran Church, I looked at 2 seminaries here in Chicago and decided to come here basically because Ohio's like Midwest and Chicago's Midwest, the culture and so on. I wanted something to kind of different. I always had a little thing in my heart for Philadelphia, which I think goes back to some baseball stuff. But, I'm a farm boy.
It was on the farm that Roger encountered migrant workers whose working conditions were eye-opening.
My first job with any kind of salary was on a popcorn farm. And the first thing we did when they hired me, I was maybe a junior or sophomore in high school, they asked me to come out, and the first thing I did was to fill these bags with corn cobs. And I didn't quite understand why, but what I was doing was putting corn cobs in a bag. They would be put on these metal frames in an old chicken coop, and that was where the farm workers would sleep. Farm workers coming up from Texas, or I think basically from South Texas or maybe Mexico. And it was just kind of then I got to know some of the people who were migrating, who were migrant workers. And I think that that experience kind of, because that was pretty gross. I mean, just putting corn cobs in a bag and putting them on the frame in a little chicken coop, low ceiling chicken coop outside in the summer. It was a long time ago, but that still sticks with me.
Upon Reverend Roger's arrival to Philly in 1965 for seminary school, his Midwestern nice was greeted with East Coast attitude.
Well, I remember getting on a bus with my suitcase and everybody looking at me kind of strange because I don't think anybody else had did that. And I also remember at some point, I think what first place I stayed was the Y, which was down on Arch Street. And I remember walking up to Lehigh Avenue to Connie Mack Stadium to a ball game. And you grew up in the country, you see somebody, you wave to them. So I'm walking through North Philadelphia waving at people who, you see so many people that they don't need to wave. But for me, coming from the country, I just remember that I figured out some people were looking at me strange because nobody else waves. Not to mention that the young white guy with long hair walking through basically black neighborhood in North Philadelphia was a little strange too.
When Ellen shows up in the early 80s, her experience of the city is initially even more off-putting. Minnesota nice, it was not. However, it eventually lands her in Olney, where she and her husband have been living to this day.
I moved to Philadelphia in 1983 to go to grad school at UPenn. I lived in West Philly for a number of years with my partner. Frankly, there was a lot to love about West Philadelphia. Accessible, beautiful, lots of trees. But I found it a shockingly hostile place to be an Asian American. Not that Minnesota was perfect and not that it was not racist or whatever, but I did not grow up having the experience of people just to my face, like saying really hostile, aggressive, racist things to my face. And that happened to me a lot in West Philadelphia. As we started talking about moving from being renters to buying a place, and we were just imagining where in Philly we would like to go. My spouse is Anglo, I'm Asian. We were like, well, where in Philly could we be comfortable? And we were trying to think of places that kind of multi-racial, multi-ethnic places. Most of those multi-racial and multi-ethnic places in Philly are that way because it's like the place where a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood meet, and then in between there's some mix of people, or because gentrification is going on. There aren't that many multiracial places that aren't one of those two things. Also, we just started looking around Olney, and we were like, okay, you know what? And so we found a beautiful wider house with a yard, a corner lot. So we were just found a beautiful home that was affordable to us that we thought would fit our needs. Our house is perfect. It's got a nice yard. I feel like a little bit we're space hogs at this point. There's just two of us in this very large house. Our kids are now gone. Ironically, it feels like Olney has become a little less Asian since we moved here, but it still feels very diverse. And we chose a house close to the regional rail, close to subway hub, just accessible. We kind of like to plant roots and be here.
Ellen shares with us some interesting insights into living in Olney, which segues into her thoughts about gentrification and development.
I joke with my friends, it's like, oh, we're the one place where our property values are not escalating. It's a mystery to me why people view rising property values as a good thing. And it's the thing that tends to drive people away and make places not affordable, right? I am not the expert on Olney. This is just me being a neighbor. But it feels like Olney has benefited from a certain amount of benign neglect, right? And being overlooked as a hot spot for development. It's not like people are rushing here to spend $300,000 for a house or, that. And also has not been the target of large development projects that can kind of really disrupt a community, right? So I feel like Olney is the kind of neighborhood that's more like, okay, it's businesses that are human in scale, and it's, neighborhoods and streets that are also kind of human scale places, right? And having the businesses, to me, seem pretty reflective of the people who live around here. So there's not this feeling of being the site of kind of invasion or tourists or that kind of thing. So it's really a question of what you value, right? Like when people say, oh, we have to revitalize down by where the Sixers want to put their stadium, it's like, well, how do you define what it is you're looking for? Like, what is the quality of life situation that you want to attract, that you think a 76ers arena will bring to Market Street, right? And to me, those things tend not to actually bring quality of life to the people who actually live there.
Speaking of gentrification, after Reverend Roger graduated from seminary, He landed in what is now the Fairmount neighborhood prior to it being developed and when it was still mostly a low-income community of color.
I was very attracted to the civil rights movement. Felt that the call that I had was really to do work, healing work as much as possible, given the kind of division that still exists in our country between people who have power and people that don't, and to try to make some connections between those communities, and that was my calling, and that the church affirmed that calling by in the Lutheran church, you get a call. When you get out of seminary, you get a call to a congregation or to a work. So that word is actually used, and that was my calling, was to work in this congregation close to where community college is now. In those days, it was a different community. It was a lot of gang fighting and a lot of poverty. I felt was my call. You know, and included for us, it includes preaching and doing the sacraments, funerals and weddings. You know, you do those kind of things, you kind of get involved closely with the neighborhood. So it was very challenging and exciting time for me.
Reverend Roger describes one of those challenging times when a rash of violence in the neighborhood mirrors what's going on in our city today.
There were a lot of Puerto Rican families. There were a lot of black families. There were some poor white families. And we're talking about maybe what is called now the Art Museum area. My church was near 17th Street, 17th and Mount Vernon, a little bit above Spring Garden Street. So there were also people looking at that area who were essentially gentrifiers and who wanted to invest in the properties and get the poor people out so they could fix them up and gentrify the neighborhood. So all of that was going on. There was once, I was ordained in 1968, and then we had some changes where I was in charge of this small congregation in 1969. There was a period, I think it was 6 weeks, where we had 5 funerals, and each one was for somebody, young men between the ages of 11 and 21 who'd been shot and killed as part of the gang fighting in that area. So it was a pretty intense time. There was a mother in the neighborhood who organized folks, including me, to when there was a story, that when the word was out that there was going to be a gang fight, she would call people together and go out and march people in between the gangs. Fairmount Avenue was kind of a dividing line, and we would go up there. This woman, B. Travers, B was actually for a while the president of my congregation. But when she was out there between the gangs, she had the vocabulary of a truck driver or something. She just cursed the kids out. And that and a bunch of other work, a lot of work went in. There were anti-gang programs and so on that I think had some effect. But it kind of slowed down the gang violence. Yeah, you see what's happening today, and it does kind of remind me of the 60s and 70s. But in those days, it was more territorial. There seems to be more proliferation of guns, incredible. And then the relationship to drug selling is still there.
Reverend Roger recalls another traumatic incident that further deepened his bond with the Latino community. In particular, this incident opened his eyes to injustices stemming from the United States' problematic relationship with Puerto Rico.
In my church, I think it was 1969, it might have been 1970, we had a member, a young person, who was shot and killed by an off-duty policeman. They were in a bar, and my friend, we called him Twine, Ray. Ray's friend got into a fight with another man, and they went outside, and Ray got in the middle trying to break up the fight, and he was shot and killed. The person who shot and killed him turned out to be, the other man was an off-duty police officer. And police claimed that Ray had a weapon. He raised his hand, and that's why he was shot. People I know who were at the bar that I knew really well and trusted, including this guy's family, wonderful family, Brooks family, said no, that wasn't true, and I believed them. So anyway, we got involved in some organizing that wasn't real popular, especially with some of the police were different. There were a lot of problems with police in those days. It was Frank Rizzo days. And the relationships between the community and the police were not good. Anyway, it created some controversy. So at some point there was drug selling in the neighborhood where kids' names, Latino kids' names, were being put in the press. And a group called the Young Lords Party, which had formed in Chicago and then had been really strong in New York City, wanted to organize in Philadelphia. And what they wanted to do was to get that kids in that neighborhood. They wanted to protest that publicity of kids being involved in the drug sales and so on in the neighborhood. So what they wanted to do was get a place where they could bring people in, they get some medical backup, try to get people off the drugs, but also publicize the unfairness of the thing. That was Young Lords Party. So they met with me, and they had taken over a church in New York, and we agreed they would take over my church. It wasn't a hostile takeover. Some people opposed it. But that was, for me, kind of an eye-opener in terms of I had been working with some people in the neighborhood who were Puerto Rican, but I really didn't know much about Puerto Rico. I didn't know anything when I was in Ohio. I knew a little bit about Mexico because of the families I knew. But the Young Lords were a very progressive organization. They're similar to the Black Panthers. So one of their agendas was to teach history of Puerto Rico, and to raise issues related to Puerto Rico. And I was fascinated by it. Because of that, my church then became a place where people in the Puerto Rican independence movement would show up or meet. That was the road that I felt called down to follow. And I love the folks that have built a sense of community around that issue, and really trying to decolonize Puerto Rico, because the relationship is very abusive. But people grow up thinking that, a lot of Puerto Rican families grow up where the message is, we need the United States to protect us, to give us Social Security, well, not Social Security, but to give us financial support. But just the opposite is true. Financial relationship between Puerto Rico and the United States benefits basically rich people in the United States much more than it benefits Puerto Rico.
Gradually, both Reverend Roger and Ellen, in their own time and space, find their footing in Philadelphia and begin raising their voices even louder for those whom they have embraced in their activism work. After joining Asian Americans United as a summer staffer in 1988, Ellen eventually took the helm as their executive director in 1996 and led the organization for almost 20 years. Similarly, Reverend Roger's advocacy for the Latino community grew, and in 1979, he and his family migrated north to the Hunting Park area to serve the neighborhood. We will pick up their stories in part 2 of this episode, when both Ellen and Reverend Roger begin investing more of their time in support of the next generation by addressing the inequities within the Philadelphia public education system. They also explore what allyship looks like in their fights for justice. We're going to leave you with a parody version of Miley Cyrus's Wrecking Ball, adapted by the No Arena in Chinatown campaign as a protest song.
It's a crying shame. We will never want you. You came in with a wrecking ball, completely disregarded us, but you don't get to make the call.